What does taking another sip of your coffee and aspiring to be a doctor one day have in common? One is very simple, very concrete, and the other is very abstract and long-term. But they're both goals, and it's highly likely that the brain developed a similar mechanism and process for both creating and for managing and monitoring both of these different goal types. But how does the brain do that? And what parts of the brain are involved in this whole process? And the most important question is, if we can understand how all of this works and how it all unravels in the brain, can we use that information to set better goals in our own lives? Can we improve our attention? And can we use this information to understand our identity a little bit better, who we are as a person? We're going to answer all of these questions plus so much more in this fascinating conversation that I had with Andrew Cooper Sansone. My name is Taylor Guthrie, and this is my channel, The Cellular Republic. It's a place where we explore how the brain works. And we try to give you, as the viewer, some power and some insight to be able to make positive decisions and positive changes in your life. Now, Andrew Cooper Sansone is becoming a good friend of mine. He's a great collaborator. He runs one of my absolute favorite YouTube channels, Sense of Mind. He interviews some of the top neuroscientists in the world. These are people that I've personally looked up to for years. He creates excellent neuroscience explainer videos and puts so much work into making sure that they're up to date, that they're all backed up by good science. I highly, highly, highly recommend checking out his channel. But in the meantime, I really hope you enjoy this conversation that we had about goals, about attention, identity, even meditation. So there's a few bugs in the Zoom feed that I hope you can push past because there's really good content. But without further ado, here it is.
Awesome. All right, so this is a kind of a new format we're testing out. So be really interested to hear from people listening, whether they like it or not. So really excited to be talking with Andrew Cooper Sansone. We've done kind of a conversation before on his channel, and I think it went really well. Had a really fun talk together, and I think this time we want to kind of have more of a conversation about some kind of cool topics. So if you could, Andrew, just kind of introduce yourself and kind of tell us why you're passionate about kind of science communication and what you do and where to find you and stuff like that.
All right. Well, hi, everybody in the Cellular Republic. So yeah, I'm Andrew Cooper Sansone, and as Taylor mentioned, we've spoken before on my channel, and definitely check out that interview if you're interested. But yeah, I mean, I guess a little bit about my background. That is what you asked about, right? Yeah, sorry. Okay. Already off track. No, my background, I have a degree in cellular and molecular biology, a bachelor's degree. And I quickly after graduating started working in a neurobiology lab at the University of Colorado. And did a lot of like testing, doing kind of behavioral testing with mice and as well as cellular and molecular physiological tests, things like that. But anyway, after a couple of years of working there, I decided that science communication was really where I wanted to go. I had been blogging on a website that I created back in 2018 called Biology and Life. And it was just this place for me to kind of dump my thoughts and my ideas about science and pretty much everything else. But at a certain point, I got more interested in neuroscience and really talking about the brain and the mind, and started this project, this Sense of Mind. That's what my channel is called, with a woman by the name of Catherine Novikov, who is runs a foundation called the Diamond Mind Foundation. And we came up with this general idea of starting this channel and trying to sort of advance the mission of the foundation, which is, as stated, is to help people see without distortion. And on like my part of that was to try and give people an accurate understanding of how their brains and their minds work by trying to dive into and sort of dissect the most up-to-date science, whether that's from popular books or scientific articles, or just trying to kind of bring that together and give people a coherent view of how the brain works. I guess I tend to come from a more like molecular perspective. I have a lot of videos on GABA and dopamine, glutamate, serotonin. Yeah, then discovered this channel, and we've been starting a collaboration ever since, and excited to keep it going today.
Yeah, no, it's exciting stuff. And I highly recommend anybody to check out Andrew's channel. It's fantastic stuff. I mean, the interviews that you're getting are with people that I've like idolized for so long. I'm like, really, you have him on your channel? No, it's been awesome. And it really some cool ways of looking at the brain and different perspectives. So highly recommend checking that out. So I think today we're going to get into kind of a cool topic. We're going to talk about goals and attention and how those are kind of linked to one another. Tie in some of kind of my work with the self and identity and how all of these processes can tie into that, some of that stuff, but going to have kind of a free-flowing conversation about some of the stuff. So I think we're going to start with kind of what a goal actually is. You want to take a stab at that, Andrew, and maybe go back and forth a little bit?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I kind of cheated. I have the APA definition of a goal with me, but I'll kind of just I don't want to throw in a bunch of jargon and unnecessary words. So I would just say that it's really an outcome, some kind of outcome that you are striving towards. So it could be, a long-term goal. It could be something that you're going after for 30 years, trying to complete, I don't know, a book or some giant project or something like that. Or it could even be something as simple as clicking play on a YouTube video that you want to watch. It could, there's these different scales of goals, but I guess that would be my kind of overall definition.
And I think that's really important because I think when people think about goal in general, a lot of it kind of wraps into these kind of long-term, trying to accomplish these grand things, but goals are something that the brain is doing every single moment of the day, right? Just picking up your coffee cup involves some type of a goal process of identifying like, I'm thirsty and I need another drink. And I think what's really cool is starting to think about how these kind of small goals are kind of blown up into these bigger, more long-term goals, especially thinking kind of evolutionarily, like how we got there. But like, it's interesting to start thinking about this too. I mean, we have this kind of this definition of like a desired outcome or whatever, but thinking about it more in terms of processing, like what the brain is actually doing in order to kind of facilitate creating one, managing one. What do you kind of think about that?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of our conversation is going to come down to the frontal lobes and maybe the prefrontal cortex, because I think the way that I think about this, and this may be different than where you're coming from, it seems like the clearest place, like if we were to say that there's a place in the brain where we find goals, it would probably be the prefrontal cortex, although I would like a caveat for that would be that it's not just there. It's of course like distributed as activity in networks throughout the brain, but that without the prefrontal cortex, goal setting, even achieving goals, coming up with a plan of action to how you're going to achieve those goals, all that stuff becomes a lot harder, if not impossible, without a PFC.
No, I completely agree. And I mean, even thinking, so prefrontal cortex, for those that don't know, is everything that's involved in the frontal lobe that doesn't involve like direct motion type stuff. Because there's a huge part of the frontal lobe that's supplementary motor areas, premotor areas. And I think this is kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but it's interesting thinking about kind of the processing in the frontal lobe as kind of originating from this kind of motion type perspective, that there's some researchers that argue that the brain's entire evolution was the need to move through our environment. And it's really interesting when we're thinking about kind of these really simple goals that we're trying to achieve, right? These needs, these physiological needs that we have to eat, to drink, all of these kind of things, they involve a ton of information collection, information processing, planning type things. And then once all of that planning is done, there's still this whole process of like monitoring, making sure that we are moving towards that outcome that we actually want to achieve. And I think that you're right on the money there with the frontal lobe. I think that a lot of the research is pointing at the type of processing that occurs in the frontal lobe as being really kind of integral for first of all, for creating the goals in general, which I think we can kind of dive into a little bit in a second, but also for that entire monitoring process of really kind of making sure that the plan is actually being achieved so that we can kind of adjust our activity accordingly once we see kind of errors that we're making, like we reach for a coffee cup and we reach the wrong spot, then our brain can adjust and adapt. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to throw in there, just to give kind of people something to think about with that. The cognitive neuroscientist David Better, he wrote a book about cognitive control, which you may have heard of in terms of executive function. So things like some of the things we're talking about: planning, monitoring your actions, changing an action if it's off course. Things like that are largely, or at least they're very dependent on the prefrontal cortex. And so he says his kind of like slogan is that cognitive control is the process that bridges knowledge and action. So you can have knowledge and you can have like a detailed plan of how you're going to do something, and yet to complete those actions, you actually have to have this intervening cognitive control process. And one way they know that is that early on, sort of in the history of neuroscience, people would get frontal lobe injuries. And depending on where it was, they might not show any real cognitive deficits, anything like a decreased IQ or anything that you'd think of, other than they just couldn't do this kind of cognitive control, this implementing of an action plan. Even if they knew how to do something, it was just keeping the moving pieces together was too much, or they couldn't keep track of where they were in the sequence. But anyway, that might have gone a little off track too.
No, that's really interesting. There's kind of an anecdote that I talk about in my cognitive control lecture that was really kind of funny. There was this doctor that had, I mean, funny I guess isn't the right word because we're talking about patients, but he had this group of patients that all had frontal lobe damage, and just like you were saying, there's not a lot of kind of obvious deficits that you see kind of on the surface. But he brought this whole group to the grocery store, and he gave them a grocery list of what to go in and get. And I think there was like 6 patients that he had, and not one, and it was a short list. I think it was like 10 items on the list. Not one of them was able to actually complete the shopping list. Like one person picked up a newspaper and just got like super distracted and was reading the newspaper, actually like walked out of the store without paying it. And someone had to chase him down to get him. And it's one of these things where exactly like when this region is damaged, we don't have the ability to really stay on track, to really make sure that we're kind of monitoring and creating the actions that are necessary to kind of bridge that gap between knowledge and action. And I think this may be kind of a good time to bridge the gap a little bit and to zoom in a little bit, because I think understanding what may be happening at the cellular level in some of these regions will really help to kind of put the pieces together when we start looking at kind of this overarching idea of what a goal is and these network properties that might be influencing these things. But let's talk a little bit about kind of what neurons may be doing in the frontal lobe. And I'm curious whether you have kind of any insight into that. I know I have a couple of experiments that come to mind, but
in terms of goals and okay. Well, so I guess as far as if we're talking about individual neurons, that might be difficult for me to talk about, but well, maybe, I don't know, maybe you should go first. I've got some ideas. I want to make sure I'm on track though.
No worries. Yeah, I'm thinking of some of these single cell recording studies that have been done in the frontal lobe that really kind of show us that the neurons in the frontal lobe are acting a lot differently than some of the neurons that we see in other parts of the brain. And a lot of it is linked to this kind of delay period activity. So there's one that I'm thinking of in particular where they had these monkeys that they were doing single cell recordings from or multi-cell recordings from. And they had these kind of two spots that they could put food. And the monkey saw where the food was put, and then this like shade was brought down. And what they found was that these neurons in the frontal lobe were firing through the entire delay period. Like it's in the left, it's in the left one, it's in the left one. And then they would stop as soon as the shade came back up. And they did this multiple times. They did it for 30 seconds, they did it for 5 minutes, they did it for 3.5 minutes. And these neurons would fire for the whole delay period. They were kind of keeping this information online. And I think that's something that's really interesting to think about, of how the frontal lobe might be acting a little bit differently. You have these other regions that are kind of processing sensory information and kind of passing it to other regions. But I think the frontal lobe might be just kind of keeping things online. And that might be related to goals, because goals require that we have to like keep a certain amount of information online to be able to work towards something.
Yeah, definitely. I think if we that is a super interesting experiment, and I mean, there is also some I think it's some of Antonio Damasio's work with single cell recording in human brains in patients who are undergoing some kind of surgery. I think like implanting deep brain stimulating devices or something. But regardless, they have an electrode in their frontal cortex, and they're measuring the response of neurons during a decision-making task. And one thing they found was that these neurons, they could use the activity pattern of a relatively small number of them to predict whether somebody, what their decision, a yes or no decision, whether what it was going to be, whether they would say yes or no. So that may be another interesting aspect of frontal cortical function, that it's kind of involved in this switching between behaviors or deciding what we're going to do next. But I mean, if you want to, we could zoom out a little bit, but I'm happy to stay with neurons and neural circuits and whatnot.
I think we can definitely zoom out a little bit, because I think that ties in really well with kind of this direction that we're going, of like these neurons. What you were just talking about and kind of what I'm talking about is really tied into this, like keeping information online, but also using that information that we are keeping online to make plans, to work towards some specific outcome. I mean, I think zooming out, you think about what working memory really is. I know there's a lot of debate in the field about like what is actually going on. Frontal lobe is supposedly really involved in working memory type tasks. And to me, I kind of see that as a like, hey, I'm keeping on what's happening right now in this current situation, but I'm also kind of integrating these other things from past experiences, from things that I know about the world, bridging this gap, like you said, between knowledge and action. And I think that when you kind of look at these kind of microscopic type things, that you can blow it up and you can kind of look at kind of inferring how these things might be working together to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing to keep in mind with all this is that, you know, we are talking about individual neurons, but these neurons are probably part of really fairly widespread networks that involve not just frontal cortex, not just the cortex, maybe in the back, the parietal cortex, but also subcortical regions, things like the basal ganglia, especially, and the striatum. And another thing that David Better talks about a lot is these corticostriatal loops. So feedback loops between the striatum, which is really involved in both movement and kind of reward and habit processes, and then the frontal cortex, which is, as we were just talking about, involved in keeping information online and decision making and sort of deciding the course of action. So there's communication between these regions on deciding what exactly an action we're going to take, based on some of this, perhaps some of the information that's being held in working memory.
And it's interesting you talk about kind of all of these different brain regions. There was a really interesting fact that I came across a while ago, and I don't have the exact reference for it, but it was talking about how the frontal lobe itself is connected to every single part of the brain by at most one synapse. Now,
wow,
And when you really think about, I mean, the frontal lobe is huge. So we're not saying that like every part of the frontal lobe is connected to like every part of the brain, but it does show that like the frontal lobe is really kind of the communication or the information gatherer, right? It's like trying to figure out what all of the other parts of the brain are doing in order to kind of integrate it and come up with a plan and make a decision. I mean, a plug for like my Cellular Republic philosophy in a way. I very much see it as being kind of the top of this hierarchy, right? Of this, like if you look at the brain itself as being this kind of governmental organization type thing, and you think of a government and society, the regions that have the most information are the ones that are able to make the best decisions, right? So it's gathering from all of these different regions in order to really come up with the best picture that it can on where we should move next, what we should do next, whether we should focus on this priority or this priority. And I think this brings up kind of getting back to like what a goal is and like what that kind of involves in terms of processing. I've thought a lot about it being kind of this 3-stage process. Like in order to actually create a goal, the first thing you need to do is you need to identify a need. And I think that is one of the least understood processes in what I'm about to talk about. It's this ability that the brain has to task switch. That like, okay, I'm working on this, but I just figured out this is more important. Now I'm going to switch to this. But you have to identify a need, and then you have to come up with a plan on how to solve that need, right? And then once you come up with a plan, you need to implement it and you need to monitor it and you need to make sure that you're actually working towards that plan. And what I've seen is that steps 2 and 3, the whole planning and the monitoring phase, are very much, I mean, the literature is huge on how much of that is actually happening in the frontal lobe. And we can look at how there's differences between whether you're looking at kind of the lateral, like outside portions of the frontal lobe, whether you're looking at more of the medial aspects of the frontal lobe. There's these really cool kind of continuums of like, okay, outside stuff is more involved in like planning type stuff, working memory type stuff, keeping things online and integrating it with past things. And then when you get it more into the middle, more into the medial areas, that's more of this like monitoring process of like checking to make sure we're on track. And we're going to get to it eventually, but I think that is really highly tied to attention mechanisms. And I think attention is one of the most fascinating things that happens in the brain. But there's also, and something that I think we can kind of get to is also this kind of rostral caudal organization of the frontal lobe. Things being closer to the kind of back of the brain are more kind of concrete. We were talking earlier about these goals of like picking up a coffee cup. Like that's very concrete. You can see it, you can touch it, right? But as you get closer to kind of the pole, the frontal pole at the front, you start to get way more abstract. And so I think that this is kind of a good step to kind of think about how our frontal lobe might be different than other frontal lobes and kind of what you think about that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to add on to that, what you were just mentioning, the caudal rostral gradient, with more concrete representations being further back and more abstract being further in the front. There's this interesting fact that the top of that hierarchy seems to be this area of the PFC, the like mid dorsolateral PFC. So dorsolateral meaning kind of on the top and toward the outsides, and then mid toward the midline. So kind of a weird, or the middle. Wait, no, I'm getting that off. But it's on the outer top region of the PFC, and it seems to be where the most abstract representations are housed. And by that I mean like really like a good way of thinking about this is rule trees. So are really just more and more complex rules. So like the example I always use is if you go into a store and there's a rule sign pasted on the wall and it says no shirt, no shoes, no service. That's a really simple rule that you can follow. That would be a pretty concrete representation in your PFC, fairly caudal, I guess. But you could make that deeper by adding on kind of contingencies and complexities to it by saying like, okay, no shirt, no shoes, no service, except on casual Friday where you don't have to wear shoes. And if you're a male, you don't have to wear a shirt. And so it's like you all of a sudden added not just another rule, but you have to keep the context in mind. Is it Friday? Are you a male? So there's like, as you get deeper into that rule tree, the representation of it is going further forward in your PFC. And that region, that mid-dorsolateral PFC, where it kind of culminates as the pinnacle of that hierarchy, is thought to be one of the most expanded regions of the PFC in our species relative to other primates. Now, there's like some controversy over precisely which areas of the PFC are expanded and what that means to say that they're expanded. But yeah, that's kind of my first whack at that. There's also some other regions that I can definitely mention as well.
No, I think it's, I really like this idea of thinking in terms of evolution, especially in terms of like, if the brain has figured out how to do something, it's really highly unlikely that it's going to then come up with a completely new way of processing. What's probably happening is that it figured out how to do something, and then it figured out how to apply that to more and more complex ideas. And what I kind of, my view, and this is, I mean, this could be a little bit speculative, but it's based on kind of what I've learned about the brain, is I think that a lot of this goal planning started with motion. We talked kind of about the part of the frontal lobe that's not considered prefrontal cortex is involved in the planning and implementing of motion, right? And it's the part of the frontal lobe that we share with most of the animal kingdom. And what I think kind of happened is that we were faced with this really, really complicated problem of having to move through the world. And it involved collecting all of this sensory information and analyzing that sensory information, keeping some of it online and looking at things that have happened before, consequences about what this action did versus this action, coming up with a plan on how to then move through the world to get food, to get water, whatever it is, and then having to kind of monitor whether or not we were on the right track, whether we were staying alive, all that kind of stuff. And what I think kind of happened is that all of that is based on very concrete stuff, right? Based on what's coming in through the senses, what we can see, what we can feel, what we can touch, all of these things. But what I see kind of happening is that as organisms became more complex, our needs actually became a lot more complex. Social type needs and like pair bonding type needs, where our goals, they were not about concrete things. They were not about gathering food. They were not about kind of fulfilling these kind of physiological or safety needs that we had. And so because of that, the goals themselves, the type of information that was being held online became a lot more abstract, became a lot more kind of symbolic of like keeping relationships intact across like the different apes in our troop or whatever. And I think what really kind of started to set a lot of this apart was language coming on board. Because now we can package these abstract ideas into these words that like one word now encompasses this entire idea that all we have to do is really keep that one word online. And it kind of holds this huge amount of meaning. And I've seen like there's parts of like Broca's area being kind of expanded in the human species. And I think that what we're seeing in this kind of caudal to rostral gradient is things becoming a lot more symbolic, where it's not about having a goal of what to eat, what to drink, but goals about who we are. Like, am I a good person or not? And keeping that whole thing online and constantly checking back in, like, am I fulfilling that? Am I doing the things that serve up the values that I have of me as a person, right? Identity itself is kind of a goal about like who I want to be, what I want to accomplish in life. And I think the frontal lobe is largely kind of tracking whether we're keeping in tune with that. And I don't think it's much of a surprise that the region of the brain that lights up for the self is in the medial part of the frontal cortex. Like, I think it's a very goal-oriented process. So
yeah, I love that. I love that way of thinking about it. It's fascinating. And I mean, language does seem like it would be a ripe area for this kind of thing to grab onto, because it's so symbolic in nature. So that does just, it makes complete sense. And I mean, it was reminding me of the thing that you taught me about, the I believe Uri Hassan, his work on the temporal window, and I can't explain that very well, but I mean, I love when you talk about that. So maybe not right now. Maybe we get to that later or something. But it seems really relevant right now.
I think it's extremely relevant right now. It very much informs kind of the work that I'm currently doing. So just as a little bit of background, there are things called spatial receptive windows. They're really, really well known in neuroscience. I mean, it's what drove a lot of the cellular neuroscience. There's tons and tons of research that goes into looking at what the primary visual cortex does, what the individual cells in the primary visual cortex do. And what we found was that there's kind of this map of the spatial world in our visual cortex. And each individual cell kind of holds a certain spot in that spatial field. So that cell will fire for a very particular spot in space, for a very particular line at a particular orientation. They call them spatial receptive windows. It's like, I can show this the thing that it likes most and it will fire, right? And so this kind of new work that's being done using what they call naturalistic stimuli in the MRI scanner. A lot of previous MRI work, we were just showing people kind of static images over and over again. And then we were averaging across like 150 trials of showing them the same thing and just kind of seeing what popped up in the brain. And it's only been recently that we've been able to start looking at just, if we show someone like a full movie or a full audiobook or something, and just watch kind of how the brain is naturally unfolding and naturally tracking all of these processes, we start to see this hierarchy form in the brain. And this is really cool. This ties, I promise this ties into goal processing. But what Uri Hassan did was he took this audio transcription and he chopped it up. And so he had, in some instances, people were just listening to a random collection of words, right? And what he found was that the primary auditory cortex, the kind of first place in the temporal lobe where sound gets processed, it has a map of all the frequencies that we hear. And so people, they're listening to the same sounds, the same words. And so the auditory cortex was the same across all of these people. But nothing else really was, because it was just this random nonsense of words. But then he took the same thing and he had them listen to sentences, right? And it was just like this sentence and this sentence. There was no kind of like narrative order to the sentences. It was just random sentences. What they found is you start moving away from the auditory cortex, you have these regions of the brain that are now keeping track of longer and longer periods of information. Where now, instead of just processing sounds, they're processing entire sentences. They're checking to see whether there's like noun-verb agreement and whether the sentence actually makes sense. And then they introduced, instead of just random sentences, they gave them entire paragraphs, right? Where there was kind of this coherent structure to it. And they noticed that they're now moving away further from the auditory cortex into these other regions that are tracking even longer information, where like the only reason that I know what the pronoun he means in sentence 4 is because it was identified as Bob in sentence 1, right? And there's something in the brain that's able to keep a certain amount of information online so that it can integrate all of this new information that's coming in. And what we find is that the regions that are tracking the longest periods of information tend to fall in what's called the default mode network, which the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex is a huge part of that. I think some of these other parts may be involved because of their connection to the frontal cortex, but I think that when we're talking about goal processing, it's really important to kind of think in these temporal windows of like, there are certain regions of the brain that are keeping really, really long-term information online. And I think this, I mean, we were just talking about kind of evolution, what kind of sets us apart from other animals in the animal kingdom. I think we can start looking at things on this kind of continuum that as our frontal lobe was able to abstract more, was able to create more symbolic, these kind of placeholders, we were able to start keeping track of longer and longer and longer periods of time. And now we as humans can have a goal that's 30 years long. And we can keep track of that goal over years and years and years. And we can keep checking back in and like, am I on track? Am I really going to become a doctor, right? But I think this kind of serves up the next topic that I think is really important is how is the frontal lobe actually communicating with these other portions of the brain? And how is it actually like finding this information, which is, I think, really cool because it's starting to tie into attention, which honestly, attention is one of my favorite topics because it's just so fascinating and just like so not well understood. So yeah, I'll turn that over to you. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I just remember, like, realized a connection while you're talking about that with like, as you're talking about longer and longer goals, and supposedly these well, longer time periods that it takes to complete a goal. Supposedly that's going to take many more actions to get there, right? And it's interesting that there's this region in the PFC. I think this was Better and DeRochers. I don't know if I could pronounce this last name right, but it was a 2015 study where they saw that when their subjects were performing sequential tasks, and that there were no cues to kind of tell them what the next step was. So they kind of had to know what the next step was based on what they had just done by having gone through this sequence before and sort of memorized it. And an example of that is like if you're washing up in the shower and you kind of do everything in the same order or roughly the same order every time, and there's nothing telling you like, oh, now you need to wash your hair, now you need to wash your body or whatever. It's like you're just based on what you just did that's the next thing in the sequence. So they found that this area, this like rostrolateral area of the PFC, so really far forward and kind of out to the sides, we're tracking the sequence position in the sense that its activity increased as the subjects moved through that sequential task. And when they got to the final task, its activity was the highest. So it was kind of like slowly turning up as they're moving through this sequence. And I don't know exactly how to tie this together, but it clearly has something to do with the temporal window, thinking about this task is going to be further off in the future. And it's almost like it's that region of the brain is turning up its activity as we get closer in basically in time to that action. But yeah, I'm sorry, I kind of just took us in a different direction, but
No, that's
attention,
really,
right? That's where we're going.
no, I think what you just touched on is actually really important because I think that it's really going to inform how attention is operating with these mechanisms and how important it actually is to give the brain a set of sequences, to actually engage in a planning type mode. Because we can, as humans, we can create these really abstract, ambiguous goals, right? Something that we want to accomplish in 30 years. But the only way to actually achieve that, like you said, is to break that down into actionable steps, right? It's very energy intensive to do that. These regions of the frontal lobe require tons and tons of energy. And when you're in these planning phases, I'm sure anybody listening can relate to this. Like it's intense. It takes a lot of brain power to really engage and to think through these tasks and to break them down into all their tiny little pieces. But it's really, really important because if you go through that kind of active process of planning, and this is, I think, happening mostly in kind of, you mentioned a lot of these lateral areas, right? I think these lateral areas are really involved in kind of the very active type. You have to be engaged. You have to be like actively thinking through the sequences and giving the brain a set of sequences. But then as you get more medial, I think the medial stuff is a lot more passive, these monitoring things. And so if you give it enough fuel, if you give it enough plan, then the inside portions of the brain now have so much more to work with. And they can look for, and they can kind of train these attention mechanisms to really see whether or not we're hitting each and every single one of those little chunks. There's a researcher here named Elliot Berkman who does work on craving suppression. So he works with people who are trying to diet or people who are trying to quit smoking and things like that. And when he started his work, he very much was in this kind of distinction between the way and the will and the way, where it's one thing to know what you have to do, right? Have this goal. It's usually not enough. Like you can know that the donut is unhealthy and you're still going to eat it. Like, okay, whatever. I know it. Then there's the other side of the will of actually having this like intention. I need to stop. I need to stop. But even that is not really sufficient. And what was surprising to them and what kind of fell out of the data that they weren't really looking for at the beginning was this third kind of mediating variable that they called planfulness. That the people that were actually successful at eating healthier, at quitting smoking, and all of these different things that they were doing were the people that were actually creating actionable plans. That were like, I'm gonna only eat this much on this day, and I'm gonna do this time, and like breaking this big ambiguous goal of losing weight or doing whatever into a bunch of actionable steps. And I think this is kind of a perfect time to kind of transition into attention, because I think that what the brain is doing is that once these goals are online, once we've created a plan, and it goes to this monitoring phase of checking to make sure we're on track with the goal or meeting the outcome, that portion of the brain is actually in constant communication with the sensory areas. So I think it's important to kind of take a step back real quick and talk about kind of the flow of information through the brain, the whole like sensation to perception pathway, because I think it very much informs kind of how this whole thing unfolds. And so when we touch something, when we hear something, when we see something, all of that information is traveling into the spinal cortex, upper smell, and going up through these kind of older midbrain regions into the thalamus. The thalamus is kind of this relay station for all of the senses, and it keeps them all separate, right? You have this part of the thalamus that just has vision stuff, and you have this part that's just sound, and then it sends them to their cortices, right? So you have the early auditory cortex only processes sound. The visual cortex is only processing vision. And these kind of early regions are supposedly processing really kind of rudimentary stuff, right? Each of them has kind of a map of their perspective sense. So audition has a map of tones and frequencies. Vision has a map of the spatial visual field. You have the somatosensory, or the touch cortex, has a map of the body, right? And then as you move away from those areas, you start to see these consolidation processes happening, where it's like, let's say with vision per se, right? You have this one has a representation of a tiny line in this spot. This one has a line in this spot. This one has a line in this spot. All of these kind of feed up to these ganglion neurons that put all those together. And it's like, okay, if there's this many little lines, that's probably a long continuous line. That feeds up into another set of regions and areas that are like, okay, there's a long line here, and there's two vertical lines here, and another two here. That feeds up even further to the point where you get to these kind of like anterior temporal lobe regions where you'd actually identify the object as a table, right? So it's this building process. We're taking these little bits of information and we're putting them all together into this coherent perception. When we talk about attention, early on, there was kind of this debate between whether or not attention was happening early or late. So you got to think about this idea of like, our senses are bringing in tons of information every single second. Like everything that I'm hearing in the room right now, the seat that I'm sitting in, the light that's hitting me, all of that is going to my sensory cortices. Is all of it being processed? Is it all being turned into an actual perception? And this was kind of the distinction between late selection and early selection. Is everything being processed, and then our frontal lobe or our awareness or whatever, then selecting what was important from all the perceptions that were just created? Or is the filtering process happening really early on? Are we getting rid of everything that's just not relevant and only turning what's important into a perception? A lot more efficient.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. And it seems like there's at least some, you might call it attention process. You might call it like information refinement or something. But in the retina itself, there are, like when you're talking about visual attention, there's mechanisms like lateral disinhibition, or lateral inhibition rather, where these cells are, one cell will receive or sense like a pinpoint of light. Basically, it'll react to just a point of light, and then quiet its neighbors down, essentially, so that it can amplify that signal as this is a true signal. This isn't just noise. And you know that because these other guys, I told them to shut up, and they're right next to me. So that's just one micro example, but I think there probably there's these attention mechanisms all through the chain of what you just described.
I think so too. And I think the reason I find this so fascinating really ties into what you're talking about, because I think a lot of the data is suggesting this kind of early selection process. And somehow this filtering process is happening before anything is really processed into a perception. Like these early regions that they don't really know what they're looking at, somehow know which signals to boost and which ones to get rid of, right? And that to me is just like fascinating. This one little neuron that only knows that it's looking at this tiny horizontal line in a very specific spot of space somehow knows that that tiny line is important to our goals in the given moment. And what we see from these kind of single cell recordings is, so if you have one of these tiny neurons that likes this specific line in space, and you record it while it's looking at that line in space, it's going to fire. But then if you tell the monkey that that line is important, all of a sudden it's like firing like crazy, right? How does it know? And what I think is maybe happening is that there is this constant communication. I mean, you talked about these loops that were happening from the frontal lobe back to these earlier brain regions. And I think that there's this constant like filtering process happening of like, this is the kind of information that we're looking for. See if anything kind of fits that mold. And if it does, send it up to these higher order regions and really process it and kind of give me something more coherent to work with. And I think that idea right there, I mean, just let it sit for a minute. I think it's really powerful, right? Because it shows that what we pay attention to, what our brain decides to get rid of, and what it decides to actually process and give to awareness depends solely on what our goals are in that given moment, right? And I think it explains so many things. It explains our biases. It explains, you go out on the street and you ask 100 people if they're above average intelligence, 99% of them are going to say yes, because they have a goal about who they are and what they want to accomplish in life. And I think that tunes all of these attention mechanisms to then look for any information that fits that goal. And so like breaking these things down into smaller and smaller pieces and why that's actually important, right? So if you have this ambiguous goal, right? This 30-year goal about wanting to be financially secure, right? Just you haven't planned, you haven't done anything, you haven't given your brain anything to actually look for, right? Because these monitoring processes, like I said earlier, they're passive, right? It's this constant like, I've created a plan in these kind of lateral regions. I've decided on like what the goal is and kind of how I want to accomplish it. And then it sends it to these middle regions. It's like, okay, keep talking to the senses and keep finding anything that either affirms or disaffirms whether we're on track with that goal. And so if you have all of these little pieces that you split this big goal down into, the brain now has tons of stuff to look for.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just to piggyback on that, maybe to give people an idea of why this is so significant is like, if you think about sensation and perception and just trying to figure out what's out there in the world from all this ambiguous visual data. Some people like think, or I don't even know if anybody really thinks this, but it's kind of a simplistic model of how that works is like, you just build up this picture of the world by taking in the information and then processing what is out there. What does it look like? But really, it seems like what we're doing is more what you're describing. We're looking for features in the world and then trying to see if the pattern that we're seeing in the world is matching that. So like the way I think of it is that our brain is constantly building a model of reality that it thinks is going to be out there, that it thinks is likely to be that. And if it's not, then it updates that model using the data from the outside world. But otherwise, it's just basically confirming its predictions. So if you build a model of the world where you are above average in everything, and then, like you said, you might just be confirming that by simply not finding the disconfirmatory evidence, and your brain's just natural process of trying to confirm that the model that it has is correct. But yeah, I think as far when you're talking about goals, it is just like building a more detailed model of what it takes to get there, or what actions you should be performing, and the outcomes of what the outcomes should be of those actions, and then monitoring whether those actually match what your prediction was in the first place. But that was just kind of restating what you just said. So.
No, but I love it because it really kind of encapsulates the processing itself in a way that's really starting to shake out in like the artificial intelligence world with these like neural networks that are being built. They are essentially models, like you said. It's like, okay, the brain is developing this prediction about the future, and then is constantly checking on whether or not that prediction is correct. That's what it's communicating with these sensory regions, saying, find me anything that kind of works with this, right? And I think that's a fascinating process. And knowing that really gives you a lot of power in your life, right? It's like the reason why a diet, like nothing against people that are on a diet, but I think that the word diet is kind of stupid, because what really needs to happen is you have to adopt an identity of being a healthy person. It's not just, I want to lose 10 pounds. You just gave your brain a goal. You just gave it an outcome that it wants to achieve. And you lost 10 pounds, it solved it. That model's gone, right? If you have a model instead of like, I'm the type of person that eats healthy food, then you're constantly trying to affirm that, right? It's not about losing weight. It's not about exercising for 2 months after the new year. It's like no, I'm constantly keeping this thing online. And I think that's what kind of makes us so uniquely human, is our ability to keep a goal like that, a value, an identity process online for so long that we're able to continually add to that and continually check to see whether or not we're hitting that.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
So I know we're kind of running up on time, but this has been a really kind of fascinating conversation. I think there's a lot more that we can explore in these mechanisms, in a lot of other just kind of sensation and perception type stuff, consciousness in general. Like, does free will exist? I think there's a lot of cool conversations that we can kind of piggyback on and have in the future. I think this is a really cool collaboration.
Oh yeah, I mean, same here. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been just such a great conversation. I mean, I know you've probably got time constraints, but I can also keep going or come back, and we could circle back to some of this stuff at some later date. But whatever you're thinking, really.
No, I think we can maybe dive a little bit more into kind of. I think a lot of viewers, I think, really want to know like how to apply some of this stuff. And I think that might be kind of a cool step to. I have a little bit of time. I know I do have some time, but we can jump into a little bit more of that if you want to kind of start with that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think what you started with, as far as making your goals, breaking them down into the individual steps. I mean, I think that's the first thing you'll hear from any good sort of like life hack guru type of person, is like, just make it really actionable. Find like the smallest possible things you can do to go towards that goal, and then just keep, or follow that stepwise progression. But maybe this kind of goes along with the idea of SMART goals, and I cannot remember what that acronym stands for, but it's something, and then measurable is one of them. And I think that's really important. I think when we're talking about this monitoring process, it can be really easy to give yourself a really ambiguous goal. And as Taylor was saying, that's really hard for your sort of like midline PFC regions to grab onto, to understand like, what is it that we're actually monitoring? What's the outcome that we're trying to achieve? If your goal is like, I want to read more books, or I want to read more, that as ambiguous as that, like, what is it 10 books? Is it one book? Is it in what time period? So having that kind of quantifiable, measurable aspect of it, I think, is really important for your brain to really feel motivated to keep doing that thing.
I think so too. I mean, that ties into a lot of the dopamine process of like actually achieving an outcome. If you don't have anything that you're measuring, then there's no like basis for making that calculation. I think something that's really interesting too, when we're talking about kind of actionable things that we can do with these goals, is really thinking about arousal in terms of all of this stuff, right? So, and when I say arousal, I'm not talking about like sexual arousal. I'm talking about how awake we feel, right? And we can, I mean, people can relate. There are times when we're just like super tired and you can't concentrate on this goal or that goal or whatever it may be. And I think, and this is, I mean, this is me kind of speculating based on what I've seen. I think that the planning phase is really the energy intensive phase of like action. And it's, I mean, it's uncomfortable. A lot of these things, they, dopamine itself sets off a cascade of neuroadrenaline that makes you feel jittery and all of these kind of things. I mean, there's definitely kind of a resistance in our body to it in a way. But I think that when we have the energy, when we feel awake, I think those are the times to really dive into the planning process, to really put a lot of that energy into breaking these things down, figuring them out. Because I think that a lot of the other stuff that's going on, there's a reason it was called the default mode. That I feel like those monitoring processes are a lot more passive. And so if we can put the energy in when we have time, when we feel awake, to really kind of come up with what those different steps are. And in those moments where we are a little bit tired, those monitoring processes are still active. They're still checking to see whether you're on track with all of this stuff. And
Yeah.
I see it. I was thinking the other day, as I was thinking through this process, I was thinking about meditation, right? And I'm in no regards like a professional meditator. You know, I've dabbled here and there, but I know that a lot of kind of the introduction to meditation revolves around this whole like quieting the mind idea, right? That when you really kind of take a look inward, you see that there's kind of this just like constant flow of thoughts being brought to awareness, right? And to me, that really makes sense in terms of this goal and attention process that's happening. That I think a lot of those thoughts that are being like given to you on a platter to awareness are the thoughts that those monitoring processes are looking for. It's like, am I meeting my social goals? Am I meeting my recognition goals? Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? All of those things are just constantly being brought to attention. And what you find in a lot of the meditation research is that when you are able to kind of quiet that stuff down, frontal lobe shuts down. These prefrontal areas shut down. So it feels to me like you're shutting down the monitoring process. And instead of having this kind of biased approach of choosing what information to evaluate and what information not to evaluate, you're kind of just taking things as they are. You're just letting the senses kind of wash over you.
Yeah, okay. First of all, that's really fascinating and brilliant, because I think you might be onto something there. And two things on that, with your point about when you have the energy to do, when you have a lot of energy, high arousal state, that's when you should do the planning. I think the neuroscientist / podcaster Andrew Huberman, he mentioned that at one point on his podcast, talking about that they've found, I think these are just psychological studies of like people working at different times of the day doing different things, and finding that the sort of like planning, organization, very like intricate technical work is often best done in the morning for people. And I think he says that most people are really morning people when you get down to it. But it's the exact same thing, that you have this time to this energy to really put into that kind of like intricate planning work. And then later on in the day, that more creative work is easier to do. And I think that has to do with this default mode network and tapping into maybe kind of thought processes that aren't so attached to our immediate goals. But anyway, I'm speculating there for sure. And then the other thing I want to say about your, with mindfulness and the PFC shutting down, I mean, I think you're totally right there. And when I talked to Andrew Newberg, who studies like spirituality and neuroscience, he talked about that there's this sense of surrender. Like it's he includes it as one of the 5 elements of like spiritual enlightenment, and that surrender to, whether if you're religious, surrender to God, or if you're not, surrender to just the universe, or I don't know, the consciousness or something. But this sense of surrendering yourself is correlated with this like strong decrease in prefrontal activity. So I think I mean, you're surrendering your goals, you're surrendering the normal you, that goal of being who you are in each moment, as you were just talking about. It's like that's all going down. And that's just really, really cool the way you put that.
Think about how powerful that is for things like anxiety, right? I think a lot of anxiety processes revolve around us being unsure about whether we're actually achieving our goals, right? Constantly getting this feedback from our attention of like, you're not on track, you're not on track. And that could be a really nice tool. My wife's a therapist. She takes a very like mindfulness type approach to a lot of the stuff that she does. And I think that's really important, of like being in the moment, kind of shutting down some of these goal processes allows you to really kind of settle down, think about what actually is important, right? So a lot of people don't like Maslow. I like to think of things in terms of needs, but this goes back all the way to Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle was talking about kind of the prioritization of the things that we need to do. You had Plato or Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. Aristotle followed on that and was like, the unplanned life is not worth examining. And a lot of that, I think, revolves around kind of this process of getting around using your frontal lobe, shutting down some of this just chatter because of all of these goals that are going on, and really analyzing a lot of what's going on. You talked about creativity, these moments in like the evening where you have like less energy than you did before, but you're able to really kind of get out of that like intentional type mode, and you're able to say, okay, I'm not hungry, I'm not thirsty, I feel accepted by my peers, right? I feel like I'm recognized. I'm going to take a moment to really just like think about who I am, think about my values, get in touch with my identity. And I think that those moments are like really powerful for getting back on track, getting outside of these kind of anxiety processes. And it's a power that we have as humans that I think a lot of kind of reactionary type living in other organisms doesn't really allow for.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really fascinating. I was just gonna say, I kind of lost my thought there, but yeah, sorry, totally lost it. That's my bad.
I think our arousal process is
Oh no, yeah, okay, sorry. I that brought it back. Yeah, no, I was just gonna mention that like rest, taking that time to rest, kind of allows the default mode network, where you're not really thinking about anything in particular, to come online. And a lot of people, when they're in a really restful state, have these really creative ideas that just pop out, seem to come out of nowhere, or that maybe they're not even that creative, but they solve a problem that you have been thinking about for a long time and couldn't figure out. Maybe you weren't thinking about it consciously, but it was just kind of formulating and happening in the background. And then eventually this answer just pops into mind. And I mean, I think that's got to have something to do with kind of stepping back from the goals themselves, or maybe, I don't know, taking a wider view of everything and then just seeing these, I don't know. I'm not I'm not getting it.
And I think, I mean, this is kind of speculation too, but it could very much be tied into these processing mechanisms that we talked about before, of like keeping certain things online. But then also, I think the important thing for creativity is the integrative part, right? Of like, okay, so we have this goal and we have this goal, we have all of these other things, and like we have all these things that we know about the world. I think what the frontal lobe is doing a lot of the time is it's just kind of flexibly combining all of these things. Like, okay, I have what I know about what's going on right now with this goal, but I also have like all of this information. And does this kind of fit with this? There's a lot of research that actually shows that a ton of integration happens in the frontal lobe. And I think integration is like the key creativity. When you think about artificial intelligence, right? The holy grail, I think, of artificial intelligence is creativity. A lot of these programs that they create are really good at the things they created them for, right? but they're not able to then take what they learned from that task and apply it to a bunch of different other ones. And I think we don't know necessarily yet how a lot of that is unfolding, but I think that a lot of it has to do with this really heavy work that the prefrontal cortex is doing, and the fact that we have such a big one in humans that's able to really just be doing tons and tons of integrative work all the time. Could be what's happening in dreaming, this kind of flexible combination of information to just mash things together and see if something unfolds. I don't know.
Yeah, no, totally. That last point I wanted to mention there, it was on with evolution and this idea of integration, that the areas further back in the PFC or the frontal cortex generally, as we mentioned, tend to be evolutionarily older, and they have to do with movement. And then, as we were talking about, that concrete to abstract, caudal to rostral gradient. But interestingly, in addition to that gradient, there also is this connectivity, this change in connectivity, so that the areas further back in the frontal cortex or PFC tend to connect more widely with sensory and perception areas of the brain, whereas those further toward the front connect more. They actually have more connections and are connected more with each other than with other parts of the brain. So I think, that definitely factors into what you're just talking about.
Absolutely. I think that's what helps with us being able to create such abstract ideas, kind of removing ourselves from the senses a little bit, creating these just kind of grand models of the world that involve this kind of flexible combining of all of this information. And it's interesting that you brought the whole like older to newer type stuff up, because it has a huge impact too on development. The reason that kids are not very good at creating and managing goals is because it's a fancy couple of terms. Ontogeny follows phylogeny. But what that term means is that development itself from childhood to adulthood follows old to new brain structure development. So regions of the brain that are relatively new tend to grow last. And so these regions that are able to create these grand models and to really kind of keep track of these really abstract symbolic goals are the ones that don't develop until we're in our 20s. And so it's an interesting thing to think about. So I have a meeting I got to get to, so I'll have to cut it here. This has been absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed having this conversation, and I think we should have many more to come in the future.
Likewise, man. Let's keep it up. This is great. Thank you so much for having me on.
If you like this channel and you want to help keep us going, there's some really creative ways that you can do that. First, check out my wife's awesome gift shop that she's put together. She's created all kinds of really creative neuroscience and psychology inspired gifts like shirts, mugs, and other things, among a whole host of other really cool creative designs in other domains. You can check out in the description below. I have some discount codes for some online courses that I teach, but ultimately the easiest and the freest way that you can help the channel is actually to sign up for a free trial of Audible. Now, I don't personally push any kind of a product that I don't believe in. I have over 4.5 months of listening time on Audible. I've put down over 300 books. And it's all been when I've been doing things like the dishes and yard work and driving around to do errands around town. It was all times that I didn't have time to have a physical book in my hand. And it's allowed me to absorb so much information and put down so many good books. And when you sign up for a free trial, you get a free book. So I highly recommend Livewired by David Eagleman. It's a fantastic book, really great author. You'll learn a ton about the brain. And even if you cancel your subscription, you get to keep the book. And it also still helps the channel if you cancel your subscription. So give it a try. I guarantee you'll like it. Thank you again so much for watching, and we'll see you for the next one.